Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where clean was a fantasy, and smell was a form of communication. Not the kind of history with swords and queens, the kind with chamber pots and vinegar rags. This won't be terrifying, just slowly, wonderfully disgusting. Perfect for sleep. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy drifting through the most awkward corners of history with me. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is over there. It's always fun to see who else is trying to sleep through filth and folklore. Now, imagine waking up in the year 1243. Your blanket is damp. Your shirt hasn't left your body in 5 days. You can smell the goats. You don't own goats. And no one complains, because no one is clean. But they're trying, scraping, dabbing, hoping. So tonight, we'll breathe with them. Sniff with them, maybe even scratch with them. Let's begin. Let's get something straight. Medieval people weren't dirty because they liked it. They were dirty because the world didn't give them much of a choice. They wanted to be clean. They tried. But when your bath water is hauled from a river filled with animal waste, and heating it takes 2 hours and all the firewood you have, you start to compromise. Instead of full baths, most people went with the wipe and hope method. A damp cloth, a splash of vinegar, a few herbs shoved in the collar. Was it clean? No. Did it feel cleaner than nothing? Absolutely. Bathhouses existed. People used them. They were kind of like the town spa meets the local gossip hub meets a risk of syphilis. But then the plague hit, and everyone started worrying that warm water opened your pores, and open pores were basically an open door for death. So no more bathhouses. The body, they believed, had to stay sealed. Cleanliness wasn't about removing dirt. It was about not dying from exposure to hot air and your own vulnerability. People still made efforts. They chewed mint leaves. They rubbed ash on their hands. They stuffed rosemary and thyme in their sleeves to mask the smell of, well, themselves. Some monasteries even had routines washing the hands, washing the feet. Not for hygiene, for humility. Because if your feet stink in the name of God, that's apparently okay. Now, if you were rich, you had options. Servants could heat your bathwater. You might even own soap made from fat, ash, and prayers. It burned. It cracked. It sometimes worked. But even nobles didn't bathe often. Why, some fear open pores, and they didn't want to get caught smelling too good. Yes, smelling good was suspicious. If you smelled like lavender, people didn't think, oh, how refined. They thought witch. Meanwhile, your average villager just tried not to lose the battle completely. You'd wash your hands if you had water. You'd change your shirt if you had a second shirt. You'd air out your blanket if it wasn't snowing. And if all else failed, you just hoped everyone else smelled worse than you. Which, to be fair, they probably did. There's a big difference between being clean and feeling less filthy. Most medieval hygiene was about that difference. About controlling the stench, not eliminating it. About pretending the dirt wasn't winning. Spoiler, the dirt was always winning. But they kept trying, because when everything around you, your bed, your clothes, your air, your water feels like a slow rot, even a rag with vinegar can feel like hope. Communal baths, lukewarm soup of sin. Imagine this. You step into a bathhouse in the heart of a medieval city. The air hits you first, thick, humid, and absolutely alive. It smells like sweat, ash, old herbs, wet linen, and something faintly meaty. The kind of air that clings to your nose and makes your clothes feel damp just by standing still. Now listen. Somewhere beyond the fog, someone is laughing. A spoon clinks against a wooden bowl. A woman whispers something to a man, and he tries not to choke on his bread. Water sloshes. Someone sneezes. Someone else moans. Maybe in pain, maybe not. A baby cries, then silence again, just for a breath, until it all loops back like a strange orchestral rehearsal. This isn't some backroom debauchery, this is just bathing. Welcome to the bathhouse part hygiene, part social hub, part scandal waiting to happen. In the Middle Ages, especially in bustling towns like Paris, Ghent, and York, communal bathhouses were as common as taverns and sometimes just as rowdy. These weren't solemn places of cleansing. They were warm, wet theatres of everyday life. Picture giant wooden tubs large enough to seat a handful of people, naked, half naked, or wrapped in linen depending on the rules of the day and the mood of the crowd. You didn't just go there to scrub yourself. You went to talk, you went to eat, you went to flirt, you went to get away from your own smoke-filled cottage and let someone else boil the water for once. The medieval bathhouse was more lukewarm than hot. Firewood was expensive, and if you were poor, so was privacy. So you'd sit shoulder to shoulder with townsfolk, artisans, travellers, maybe even a priest or a merchant's daughter. There was no gender segregation in many places. Men and women bathed together at least for a while. That alone was enough to make a bishop faint. And yes, you could order snacks. Food was served in the bar, bowls of broth, cheese, bread that had gone soft from the steam. Picture yourself, half soaked, nibbling yesterday's loaf while a stranger casually rinses their armpits beside you. It was, somehow, both deeply communal and profoundly awkward. But people loved it. They kept coming back, despite the smell, despite the heat, despite the potential proximity to lice and lechery. Because in a world that rarely offered comfort, a warm bath, no matter how crowded or cloudy, was a kind of magic. For a few coins, you could forget the pigs outside your door, forget the freezing wind, forget the cold stew waiting at home. You could slide your aching body into someone else's bath water and call it luxury. And for a while, it was. But nothing so pleasurable ever escaped the church's gaze for long. By the 14th century, bathhouses had a reputation, and not a good one. The same places that once echoed with laughter and gossip were now seen as dens of temptation. Some bathhouses doubled as brothels. Others blurred the lines so well no one was quite sure what they were anymore. There were reports, some exaggerated, others likely true, of couples sneaking off behind steam-soaked curtains, of transactions being made under the bubbles, of more flesh being shared than just between scrub brushes and basins. Preachers grew louder, cities passed stricter rules, bathhouses were ordered to hang modesty cloths, to separate the sexes, to stop serving food, to stop doing other things, and then the plague came. Suddenly, heat wasn't relaxing, it was dangerous. Bathing, some said, opened your pores, and open pores were open doors. Disease, like a creeping mist, would slide right in. The same air that once smelled like rosemary and warm wood now smelled like fear. Bathhouses began to close, not everywhere. Some towns clung to them like the last warm memory of a happier time. But the mood had changed. What was once a shared joy now carried the scent of guilt. Cleanliness began to feel suspicious, maybe even sinful. Still, the image remains, faint and flickering like candlelight behind a fogged window. A man with calloused hands and a soot-darkened face sinking into a tub. A woman laughing at a joke too dirty to repeat outside those walls. Steam rising up like prayer. Oil poured over shoulders. Rags scrubbing away the evidence of another hard week. Bread, broken and shared. A little wine, maybe. A little warmth. A little moment of comfort, borrowed from a hard, cold world. And if there were sins, then so be it. In a world where you might die from bad water, bad soup, or a bad cough. The idea of being scrubbed and sinful in the same breath was, perhaps, the most human thing of all. Your bar of death-scented hope. Let's talk about soap. Not the clean, fresh, coconut-scented bar in your bathroom. Not the one that promises revitalizing hydration or antioxidant dew crystals. No, we're going back, way back, to when soap wasn't gentle, didn't lather well, and could quite literally remove a layer of your skin if you got the recipe wrong. Because in the Middle Ages, soap was less a household essential, and more a gamble with fire, fat, and blind faith. Here's how it started. You wake up itchy, that's normal. You stink, that's normal too. You want to be cleaner, at least cleaner than the sheep in the alley. So you do what your mother did, and what her mother did before her. You make soap, and that means collecting fat, not scented oil, not shea butter, fat, animal fat, the thick, waxy kind scraped from a goat carcass, or boiled off a pig's belly. You render it down into a slop that smells like wet death and disappointment. Then you add ashes, specifically hardwood ashes soak, hickory, something solid and respectable. You dump them into water and stir until you've got a murky liquid called lye. If you're unlucky, it'll burn straight through your wooden bucket. If you're very unlucky, it'll burn straight through your hand. Now mix the two fat and lye over fire. Boil it. Stir it. Pray. Because if your proportions are off, you won't make soap. You'll make a slippery, explosive sludge that might clean your body or dissolve it. And if that happens, you don't get a refund. You just get fewer fingers. Congratulations. You've just entered the artisanal world of medieval soap making. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't relaxing. It was work. Dangerous. Smoky. Foul-smelling work. And when the batch finally cooled into something vaguely solid, you still weren't sure if it was safe to use. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it turned into a sticky mess. Sometimes it cracked like dried mud and crumbled apart the moment it touched water. And sometimes it stung. Bad. But people used it anyway, because it was better than nothing. And in some places like Marseille, Aleppo, or Venice, people got good at it. Really good. Professional soap makers emerged, guilds formed, they added olive oil, laurel oil, herbs, even perfume. Their bars were smoother, softer, less likely to leave scars, and expensive. If you had a bar of Aleppo soap on your shelf in the 14th century, you weren't poor. You were either rich, foreign, or about to be accused of sorcery. Because here's the twist soap had a reputation, not just as a cleaning agent, but as something suspicious. In Christian Europe, washing too much wasn't just odd, it was borderline sinful. There were sermons against cleanliness, warnings that clean skin led to vanity, and vanity that was just pride in a bathrobe, dangerous, effeminate, possibly French. Some clergy preached that too much soap softened the flesh and opened the soul to temptation. Real men, real saints, didn't smell like lavender. They smelled like struggle. But in the Islamic world, the story was different. Soap making had become an art, a science. Recipes were refined, passed down, tested, recorded. Muslim chemists documented methods using olive oil, lime, and herbs. Their bars were soft, fragrant, and effective. They understood saponification long before the West could spell it, and when these soaps made their way into European cities through trade or conquest, people were conflicted. They liked them, a lot, but they were foreign, and foreign meant dangerous. Some whispered that perfumed soap masked poison. Others believed it altered the humours, those mysterious bodily fluids medieval doctors swore controlled everything from mood to digestion. Still others just thought it was too nice, too smooth, too soft, not God-fearing enough. So you had a choice. Use the homemade bar that felt like a brick and smelled like a fireplace, or splurge on imported luxury and risk looking unmanly, unchristian, or worse, clean. For most people, there wasn't much of a choice at all. Soap was a luxury. Laundry came first. If you only had one bar, it was for clothes, not bodies. Human skin got whatever was left or nothing at all. Sometimes, they didn't use soap at all. They used straw, sand, vinegar, salt, even bread crusts, in some cases. The point was to rub until the surface layer gave up and took the smell with it. There are records vague, disturbing ones, of people using soap to treat lice, skin infections, even spiritual corruption. Monks made their own versions in cold cloisters, boiling fat in quiet corners and adding herbs between prayers. For them, washing wasn't just hygiene, it was humility, ritual, repentance. But for the average villager, soap was stored in a damp nook near the fire, half melted, half forgotten, sometimes soft, sometimes rock hard, sometimes missing because the dog ate it, and yet it mattered. That ugly bar represented effort, hope, control. In a world where disease came on the wind, where filth lived in your sheets and death crouched by the well, a bar of soap, no matter how crude, was a line in the dirt, a message I'm still trying to stay clean, trying to stay human. So, tonight, as you lather up with your gentle, moisturising, triple-milled, bergamot-infused body bar, take a moment to picture it. A medieval man hunched over a bubbling cauldron of goat fat and firewood smoke, eyes watering, stirring slowly and muttering, maybe just a little more ash. He didn't know what pH balance was. He didn't have lab gloves, but he believed. And sometimes that was enough. Just don't drop it. En el don no hun. Ngua seng tavu nai dung. Freelancer. The worm lives in your molar. Your tooth hurts. Not the kind of hurt that sends you rushing to a dentist with white walls and clean instruments. No. This is the kind of pain that creeps in slowly, nestles deep, and refuses to leave. It's not sharp, not at first, just a dull, pulsing ache, like something is moving in there, because they believed something was. In the Middle Ages, if you had a toothache, you weren't told it was decay, or infection, or poor dental hygiene. You were told you had a worm, a real one, a living, squirming, bad-tempered creature burrowed deep inside your tooth, gnawing its way through enamel and nerve. This wasn't metaphor. This was medicine. And in a strange way, it made sense. Toothaches didn't show on the outside, no swelling and no cuts. Just pain, invisible, persistent, cruel. Something had to be inside. Something had to be causing it. And if you ever cracked open a particularly bad molar-blackened hollow, crumbling it didn't take much imagination to see something worm-like in the damage. So the theory stuck, and it slithered its way into medieval Europe like a parasite into pulp. Naturally, the next step was to get it out. Some believed you could smoke the worm out, literally. Place a piece of burning root, maybe henbane or garlic, near the tooth. Let the smoke waft in. The idea was that the worm would find it so unpleasant, so offensive, that it would wriggle out in a panic and somehow disappear into the ether. Others had a gentler strategy. Music. That's not a joke. Some physicians, and we use that term very loosely, suggested playing gentle tunes near the mouth to lure the worm out, as if it were not a parasite but a weary traveller who just needed the right melody to pack its bags and leave. One documented method included tying a flute near the cheek and playing a soft, repetitive scale. The goal wasn't entertainment, it was eviction, which raises the obvious question, what kind of worm listens to music? The answer, a medieval one, probably imaginary, but very cultured. If that didn't work, and spoiler it didn't, there were harsher measures. Enter the barber surgeon, a man with a blade in one hand and a beer in the other. He was your dentist, your bloodletter, your occasional amputation specialist. And if your worm refused to leave, he would take the entire tooth instead. No anaesthetic, no precision tools, just a pair of iron tongs, a strong grip, and someone to hold your arms down. Maybe a friend, maybe a stranger, maybe a monk humming a hymn. The tooth came out whole, if you were lucky, in shards. If you were... Either way, you got to keep the worm real or imagine forever silenced. But not all tooth care was this violent. Some people tried to clean their teeth, not with brushes, but with powders made of crushed mint, sage, salt, or even burned bones. These were rubbed on with a cloth or a twig, the frayed ends acting like a primitive toothbrush. And if you were particularly committed, you rinsed with urine. Yes, human urine. Preferably aged. Why ammonia? It turns out, aged urine contains enough ammonia to act as a cleaning agent. Medieval people didn't know the chemical breakdown, but they knew this. It burned, it stung, and it made your mouth feel different. Whether that different was clean, or just temporarily numb, we'll never know. But to them, that was close enough. You take a mouthful, swish it around, try not to gag, and spit. Then maybe chew on a fennel seed to mask the aftertaste. Or not. Some claimed it actually helped with bad breath. Others claimed it just changed the flavour of your suffering. And of course, not everyone could afford these luxuries. Tooth pain was democratic. It didn't care how much land you owned or how many sheep grazed in your name. But dental treatment, that was another story. The wealthy could afford imported sweets preserved fruits in honey, candied roots, treats from distant markets, and those very treats slowly destroyed their teeth. Archaeologists have found skulls from nobles with severe tooth decay, sometimes worn down to the jaw. Meanwhile, their peasant teeth were often worn, yellow and gritty, but not rotten. Because sugar was rare, the poor ate rough bread and hard roots, not honeyed plums. So in a strange twist of fate, the less you had, the longer your teeth lasted. And yet, pain remained universal. Even monks, those pious men of prayer and silence, had rituals for toothaches. Some prayed to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of dental suffering. Her own teeth had been ripped out as torture, because apparently, to be holy in the Middle Ages was to be broken in oddly specific ways. There were amulets, too, wolf teeth strung around the neck, pieces of ivory, even small stones engraved with protective symbols. Anything that promised relief, anything that whispered, you don't have to pull it, One manuscript even suggested this. Take your aching tooth, bury it in a field, pray, and wait. The idea that the tooth's pain would be transferred to the earth, that the soil would absorb it, that the ache would grow into something else barley, perhaps wheat, something useful. No one recorded whether it worked, but someone, somewhere, tried it. Because pain makes you desperate, and desperation, in the Middle Ages, was just another word for innovation. So tonight, if your teeth feel just a little too sharp, a little too present, don't worry. It's not a worm, probably. Just be glad your toothpaste isn't flammable, that your dentist doesn't carry tongs, that no one is playing a flute next to your face while praying for something to slither free. Because when your ancestors lay awake with their jaws pulsing and their mouths tasting like vinegar and fear, they had one hope that the worm would go away, or that the barber would miss. Either way, something had to give. Enuben nemunenemenchivitiista pph n5, if you smell nice, you might be a witch. Manches tpt sivo I ginanketlongti, I spiral pacing vid motifkotiel chien trunung, bnc monanti ptc keng. Breath if you smell nice, you might be a witch. Let's set the scene. You walk into a medieval marketplace. The sky is grey, the mud is thick, the people are fragrant, but not in the way you'd hope. The air hums with the scent of old wool, smoked fish, wet straw, animal sweat, and something faintly decaying that no one wants to name. You get used to it. Everyone does. After all, this is just how life smells, and that's important because in the Middle Ages, smelling like death warmed over wasn't just common, it was comforting, familiar, safe. If you smelled normal, no one looked at you twice, but if you smelled too clean, too floral, well, that was suspicious. In fact, if you smelled too nice, you might be a witch. Let's back up. In medieval society, hygiene wasn't necessarily tied to morality, but scent was strong, unnatural smells, especially sweet or exotic ones, were associated with vanity, pride, and deception. And in a time when bad odours were believed to carry disease, good odours felt like lies. So if you walked through town smelling like rose water instead of wood smoke and cheese, people wouldn't think, wow, she smells lovely. They'd think, what's she hiding? What demon is she trying to seduce? Why doesn't she reek like the rest of us? It didn't help that perfume wasn't easy to come by. Imported oils from the Middle East, powdered resins from distant trees, fragrant flower distillations. These were luxuries. The kind of thing nobles dabbed behind their ears to cover the fact that they hadn't bathed in 3 weeks. To the average villager, these smells were foreign, feminine, magical, dangerous. They didn't smell like survival. They smelled like secrets. And that's where the trouble started. There are records, real ones, of women being accused of sorcery because of how they smelled. Not because they brewed potions or cursed livestock, but because they wore lavender. Because their hair smelled of cloves. Because a passing man caught a whiff of something sweet and thought, this is unnatural. There's one case from rural France. A widow accused of enchanting her neighbours not through spells, but through scent. She used dried herbs to mask the smell of the livestock she slept beside. Sensible. Yes. Suspicious. Also yes. The townsfolk believed her cleanliness was a trap, that her sweetness lured men to ruin. Because let's be clear, smell wasn't just a physical thing. It was social, emotional, political. Smell told the world what class you belonged to, what work you did, and if you broke the pattern if you smelled like you shouldn't, people noticed. So what did everyone else do? They improvised. The medieval poor didn't have perfume, but they had something better. Herbs. People would tuck sprigs of mint, rosemary, or thyme into the collars of their tunics. Women sewed dried lavender into the folds of their headscarves. Children carried little pouches of crushed sage or marjoram, worn like amulets, not for fashion, not even to smell nice, but to survive. Because when you live in a world where chamber pots are emptied into the street, where pigs sleep indoors, where mould grows in your walls and possibly your bread, the world smells bad, constantly. And herbs weren't about elegance. They were about sanity. In fact, there was an entire culture of scent defence. People wore pomanders, small metal balls filled with resin, citrus peels, and spices, dangling from belts or chains. doctors carried plague beaks those long, bird-like masks stuffed with strong-scented materials because they believed smell was what carried disease. Even monks, who took vows of poverty and silence, burned incense to purify the air during prayer, not for God, for their nostrils. And yet the line between survival and seduction was razor-thin. A peasant girl chewing fennel seeds to sweeten her breath before seeing a boy at the well might seem charming to us. But if she made a habit of it, if she always smelled fresh while others stank, people started to whisper. Who taught her that? What's she hiding that's not natural? To them, smell was moral alignment. A bad smell meant you were honest, hard-working, maybe even holy. A good smell that meant pride, vanity, magic, or, worst of all aspirations. Because in a rigid society, smelling better than your station was its own kind of rebellion. Even among the wealthy, perfume was used carefully, sparingly, symbolically. A lord might scent his gloves before a banquet. A lady might dust her linens with the rose petals, but to go about smelling constantly, luxuriously fragrant that was excessive, suspicious, perhaps Italian, and so the irony deepens. In a time when no one bathed regularly, when soap could peel your skin, and water was considered a disease delivery system, people still obsessed over smell, not because they loved it, because they feared it. They feared what a smell could say, what it could suggest, what it could betray. So tonight, as you lean back in your bed, breathing in your lavender-scented sheets, or your peppermint mouthwash, or your spouse's high-end shampoo, remember this. Once upon a time, in a damp village with no drains and no Febreze, smelling like anything other than suffering meant someone might burn you for it. Because in the Middle Ages, it was better to stink like sin than smell like seduction. Miasma bad air will kill you before the dirt does. There's something in the air, you can't see it, you can't fight it, you can only smell it. And if you can smell it, it's already too late. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where bad air didn't just make you gag, it killed you. Forget viruses, forget bacteria. These were centuries away from discovery. In the medieval world, people didn't believe in tiny organisms crawling through your lungs. They believed in miasma. Miasma wasn't a theory, it was a certainty, a law of life. If the air smelled bad, it was sick. If you breathed it in, you would be, too. And so, everything revolved around scent. Scent was the first warning sign. A pile of rotting cabbage, a sick cow in the alley, a neighbour who hadn't changed his tunic in 6 months. That wasn't just unpleasant. That was a biological threat. You see, miasma theory told people that disease floated around in the form of foul odours, literal clouds of death, drifting invisibly through the streets, slipping in through your window at night, settling in your lungs like smoke from a cursed fire. If you smelled something bad, you weren't just disgusted, you were endangered. So, naturally, people began to protect themselves. And what was the best defence against bad air, good air? That meant flowers, herbs, vinegar, spices, incense. In a strange twist of logic, perfume became the medieval version of a vaccine. If you surrounded yourself with pleasant smells, you were safe. If you carried rosemary and mint in your robes, you were defended. If your room reeked of cloves, congratulations, you were immunised. It's absurd, but not entirely, because let's face it, in a world with no germ theory, no microscopes, no knowledge of airborne transmission, scent was the only tool people had, and so they clung to it. You'd walk into a medieval home and see dried herbs hanging from the ceiling not for cooking, but for protection, rose petals scattered on the floor not for romance, but to mask the scent of mildew and rats. A doctor wearing a long-beaked mask, stuffed with flowers and vinegar-soaked rags not for style, but because he was about to walk into a house filled with plague, and this was the only armour he had. This was not eccentricity, this was strategy. The air was the enemy, and people fought back the only way they knew how, by making it smell better. Some cities even passed laws requiring fragrant maintenance. Public latrines were sprinkled with lime. Market stalls had to be swept daily, and in wealthier homes, vinegar was boiled in bronze pots to purify the room, because cleanliness, as they understood it, had nothing to do with soap or scrubbing. It had everything to do with scent. And what did they fear the most? Rot. The smell of decay was seen as pure evil, not metaphorically literally. A bad smell meant something was dying nearby, and death wasn't just an ending. It was contagious. It spread through the air like gossip in a cathedral. You could catch illness by walking past the fishmonger. You could catch it by breathing near a sick person's laundry. You could catch it, they believed, just by standing too close to a compost heap. There were scent hierarchies too. Rotten onions risky. Boiled cabbage dangerous. Wet dog and mouldy hay probably fatal. Roses, however, healing. Clove-stuffed oranges, protective talismans. Lavender practically medicinal. It got to the point where some people refused to live near butcher's knot because of the animals, but because the smell of blood was thought to spread plague. Midwives were told to carry herbs into birthing rooms. Priests sprinkled incense over the dying, not to honour them, to defend themselves from whatever foul spirit the smell might unleash. Even plague carts were sometimes lined with fragrant straw knot to comfort the dead, but to save the living. You might be laughing, but picture it. You're walking through a medieval city. The streets are damp, the air is heavy. You pass a man holding a bundle of lavender to his nose like a mask. A child clutches a lemon in both hands, eyes wide. A woman throws vinegar onto the stone floor before opening her door. They're not being dramatic, they're trying to survive. And it wasn't just people. Cities were redesigned around air. Open courtyards were meant to allow wind to pass through. Hospitals were built facing gardens. Some buildings even had rosewater fountains, meant not to drink but to smell, because to create pleasant air was to create safe space. And yet, even with all this, people kept dying, because miasma wasn't real. Not in the way they thought, but it didn't matter. Belief filled the gaps that science hadn't reached yet, and let's be honest, if you lived in a time where bad smells usually did come from filth, and filth did lead to illness, it's not the worst theory. It was wrong in the details, but it was right in the vibe. The air was bad. They just didn't know why. So they surrounded themselves with cloves and sage and burning pine and rose petals, desperately trying to hold the line. Not against invisible microbes, but against the scent of something worse, the constant, hovering reminder that the world was rotting just a little faster than anyone could clean it. So tonight, as you take a deep breath in your clean room, in your filtered home, on your mattress that isn't filled with hay and skin flakes, remember, the Middle Ages didn't fear germs. They feared the smell of death, and in a way, that's not so different. Try bathing cloth rags and silent prayers. You hold a damp cloth in your hand. It's rough, scratchy, not clean in any meaningful sense, just dryish. It smells faintly of old smoke, rosemary, and something sour you've stopped trying to identify. This is your bath, this rag, this moment, this careful, wordless routine. Because in this time and place, let's say Northern Europe, mid-15th century water is no longer your friend. Water is risky, dangerous, unpredictable. Water might heal you, or it might kill you. No one's exactly sure when the fear started. Bathhouses used to be common, even beloved steam-filled rooms of gossip, warmth, and muddy indulgence. But somewhere between plague, religion, and a growing mistrust of the body, things began to change. People started to whisper things. That hot water opened your pores. That open pores let sickness in. That bathing made you vulnerable, exposed, weak. It wasn't that people wanted to be dirty. They just didn't want to die. And so, they adapted. They stopped bathing. Not entirely, but increasingly often. And instead of water, they turned to cloth. You see, the idea wasn't to remove dirt, but to control it, to contain it, to pacify the body, not cleanse it. A bit of rubbing here, a wipe under the arms, a firm press around the neck, the face, if you had time, the feet, if you had reason. The rest covered, forgotten, left to stew. These cloths weren't luxurious. They weren't always dry, but they were safe, and safety had become more important than comfort. Some families had a designated washing rig used communally, dried near the hearth, and reused until it disintegrated. Others carried small squares of linen on their belts, worn like tools, used like blessings. One for the hands, one for the face, one, maybe, for the rest. This was called dry bathing, and for many, it was the only kind of bathing left. But cloth alone wasn't enough. The body still smelled, so they added things, powders, crushed herbs, dried flowers, ground chalk, vinegar, mixed with rosemary or sage, then dabbed along the chest and neck, perfumed oils, if you had coin, ash. If you didn't, the goal wasn't to be fragrant. The goal was to survive, to cover the scent of sweat and soil and sickness with something, anything that might fool the nose. Or, perhaps, the devil. Some carried sprigs of lavender in their collars. Others tucked mint under their arms. Some priests even blessed water mixed with cloves and instructed it to be wiped, not poured on the skin. There were prayers, too. Rituals whispered as the cloth touched flesh. Quiet, private acts of hope and fear. Keep the fever away. Keep the bad air out. Let this rag be enough. And sometimes it was. Because there's a strange intimacy to this form of washing. A stillness, no steam, no splashing, no shared tubs. Just you, your cloth, and the parts of your body you're willing to confront today. In noble homes, dry bathing became a kind of performance. Ladies were attended by maids with powders and scented handkerchiefs. Men were dabbed with wine-dipped towels and wrapped in fur-lined robes. All of it designed to look indulgent when really it was avoidance. Avoidance of water. Avoidance of risk. Avoidance of the terrifying idea that cleanliness might be fatal. And the church the church approved. Many sermons praised the rejection of baths as an act of moral strength. Saints didn't bathe. Martyrs didn't bathe. Why should you better to suffer in odour than be tempted by warm water and slippery skin? Better to be chaste and foul than clean and damned. There were, of course, exceptions. In warmer climates, southern Spain, parts of Italy, the Islamic world bathing traditions held strong. Water was embraced, celebrated, even spiritual. But further north, especially after waves of plague and war, a quiet consensus settled in touch water rarely. Smell acceptable, hide the rest. Some historians have called it a retreat from the body. Others, more plainly, call it fear. And perhaps both are true, because when you're surrounded by death-real death, not abstract, the idea of stripping naked and soaking your skin in hot water feels vulnerable, almost obscene. You've seen neighbours fall ill within days. You've watched priests die while blessing the sick. You've buried your own. You've learned caution. So you sit near the fire. You warm your cloth. You wring it out and press it gently along your chest, as if trying to calm your own heartbeat. You whisper a prayer, whether you believe in one or not, and you do the best you can. With linen, with vinegar, with the silent hope that this will be enough. Enough to keep you safe. Enough to keep you clean. Enough to keep you human. So tonight, when you step into your shower hot, clean, private, and you reach for your bottle of shampoo, and you curse under your breath because the water pressure isn't perfect, just remember. For hundreds of years, a damp rag and a whispered prayer were the only thing standing between you and the dark, and sometimes that was enough. Fear of pores, the open door, theory of death. The water is warm. It smells faintly of wood ash and boiled linen. You watch steam curl upward in the morning light, gentle as breath, rising toward the thatched ceiling. This should be a peaceful moment, but your chest is tight, not from the heat, from the thought you're not sure you should be doing this. Because here, in this time and place, in this century steeped in sweat and scripture, a bath doesn't just clean you, it opens you, and when your body is opened, anything can get in. This is the open door theory, a quiet, creeping fear that seeped into European thinking sometime around the late 1300s and refused to leave. It wasn't written in holy books or carved into stone. It was passed in whispers, in glances, in rules never fully explained. Don't bathe if you feel tired. Don't bathe after eating. Don't bathe during plague. Because a warm bath doesn't just soften skin, it softens boundaries. The medieval body was not seen the way modern science sees it. It wasn't sealed, pressurized, protected by immune systems and antiseptics. It was porous, fragile, permeable, a kind of living sponge, and heat, they believed, opened all the little holes, the pores, not anatomical facts, but portals, doorways to the soul, or worse, doorways to something waiting outside, and once opened by heat and water, they could not be shut in time, so the logic followed. If disease travelled in foul air miasma and your pores were open expanded by hot water, then what, exactly, was to stop the illness from walking right in? Nothing at all. You see, fear in the Middle Ages was not abstract. It was local, bodily. They didn't fear death in the poetic sense. They feared the moment death slipped through the skin. There are records of people refusing to bathe during summer, not because they didn't want to, but because the air was thin and moist and likely filled with invisible dangers. There were sermons that warned against excessive bathing, not only for reasons of modesty or vanity, but because a clean body invited the devil, and who could argue a naked, wet body is vulnerable, exposed? It's soft, and softness, in a hard world, is often punished. Some went further. They claimed certain illnesses could only enter through damp flesh, that the skin, like a gate, must remain shut-dree, cool, and closeless demons, plague, or unwanted humours force their way inside. So the bath, once a place of comfort and community, became a place of risk, a kind of spiritual gamble. You dipped your toe into the warm water not to relax, but to test your bravery. You bathed not to cleanse, but to confront. Some towns closed bathhouses altogether, others posted warnings. Physicians gave vague, circular advice: bathe if you must, but not too often. And only when the wind is right, and not after eating, and not during full moons, and never, ever, during plague. People developed workarounds: dry bathing, scented powders, cloth, prayer. Because it was safer to stink than to be open. Better to carry the dirt of weeks than to risk the devil slipping in between your shoulder blades. And this fear wasn't just for the sick. Kings avoided bathing. Queens, too. One famous rumour claimed Isabella of Castile only bathed twice in her life, once at birth and once on her wedding night. Even if the story was false, its popularity revealed the truth. Cleanliness was not holiness. It was indulgence, and indulgence meant softness. And softness was fatal. Some tried to close the pores again after bathing. They rubbed vinegar into the skin, or cool wine, or dusted themselves with chalk, anything that promised to seal the body. Because if the bath opened the door, maybe this could shut it again. Of course, none of this worked. But it wasn't really about results. It was about ritual, control, and the illusion of safety. Even today, you can still feel echoes of it. The nervous chill you get stepping out of a hot shower into cold air. The lingering superstition that catching a cold comes from being wet. The belief that pores breathe, even though they don't. It's muscle memory from another era. When steam meant sickness. When water was a risk. And when your own skin could betray you. So tonight, when you step into your bath hot, foaming, harmless, and you lean back into the warmth, and you feel your muscles soften, take a breath, and think of them. All those people, centuries ago, sitting beside cold buckets, rubbing cloths along stiff limbs, whispering to themselves, "Not today. Ill-bathe tomorrow, when the air is safer, when the wind changes, when the devil isn't watching." Because the fear was never just about dirt. It was about being open in a world that wanted to get in. And sometimes, the only armour you had was staying closed. Toilets where below means duck. Now it starts with a splash, a wet, ugly sound followed by a shriek from the street below, then the cursing, then the silence, because this is normal. In the Middle Ages, someone yelling from a second-story window wasn't a rare event. It was part of the daily rhythm, a warning, a ritual, a polite heads-up before the world dumped its guts on your head. The phrase was simple: guard low, literally. Watch for the water, which, of course, wasn't water. Not in any drinkable sense. It was waste. Human. Unfiltered. Unapologetic. Because for centuries, the window was the toilet. In homes without plumbing, and that meant almost all homes, people used chamber pots. Small, shallow bowls tucked under beds or chairs. You did your business there. Quietly. Discreetly. In the middle of the night or right after breakfast. And then came the next step. Disposal. If you were lucky, your house backed up onto a stream or had a private cesspit. But most people weren't lucky. So they opened the window, shouted a warning where below and let gravity do the rest. The street below wasn't clean. It wasn't paved. It was mud. And that mud was, at best, only half mud. People walked in it. Carts rolled through it. Children played near it. Chickens pecked at it. And still life went on. Because in the Middle Ages, waste wasn't private. It was public. It was shared. Everyone produced it. Everyone smelled it. Everyone, sooner or later, and stepped in it. And if you were young, say, 6 or 7, you had a very specific job in the family: empty the pot. It didn't matter if it was snowing. It didn't matter if you were tired. You were small. You were fast. You could be replaced. So out you went, ceramic pot wobbling in your hands, sloshing gently like some disgusting soup, toward the nearest window or alley or communal ditch. You didn't look down. You didn't breathe in. You dumped and ran. It was a rite of passage, really. Before you could read, before you could count, you learned how to handle excrement with efficiency and humility. There were no toilets as we know them, no porcelain, no buttons to flush, no privacy, no dignity. Even in castles, the facilities were rudimentary. They had guard-robed small stone rooms built into the outer walls, with a seat cut above a chute. The waste would drop straight down, into the moat or a pile of hay or onto a waiting pig. Yes, a pig. Because in some places, pigs were used as mobile sanitation units, rooting through the refuse, turning human waste into bacon with admirable indifference. And in monasteries, where silence was sacred and routine was everything, toilets were sometimes built over rivers, practical, efficient, but not exactly contemplative. City planners eventually tried to fix the problem. They created open sewers, shallow trenches running through the middle of the road, a small step up from nothing, but not by much. These ditches overflowed in the rain, dried into dust in summer, and froze solid in winter, forming glossy, treacherous streets made of pure regret. The stench was constant, so bad, in fact, that some towns passed laws requiring people to shout before dumping waste. Failure to do so could result in finza, in rare cases, getting hit with your own pot contents by an angry pedestrian with good aim. But compliance was spotty. People got lazy, or spiteful, or just didn't care. And so, walking through a medieval town wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. You learned to hug the walls, to watch the windows, to listen carefully for a cry from above, because if you heard nothing it might already be too late. This is why medieval people wore hoods, not for fashion, for protection. And it wasn't just human waste. Animal waste was everywhere, too. Horses, dogs, chickens. There were no street cleaners and no trash bins, no tidy garbage schedules. Rot was part of the infrastructure, and yet life went on. People adapted. They wiped with moss, with straw, with linen rags that were washed and reused until they gave up entirely. Soap was rare. Water was precious. Clean was a matter of comparison. And strangely, amid all this filth, there was a kind of rough community. Everyone smelled. Everyone stepped in it. Everyone watched out for the shout from above. Waste was the great equalizer. It didn't matter how rich you were if you walked under the wrong window at the wrong time. You were one step away from disaster. And so, people developed reflexes, a sixth sense, a kind of civic twitch that kept them alert. Eyes on the upper floors, ears tuned to the call, feet ready to jump. Modern historians read these records and shake their heads. They try to imagine a world where people treated sanitation like a neighbourhood announcement, and yet here we are, still avoiding the splash zone. So tonight, when you flush your toilet in your quiet, clean, private bathroom and you listen to that neat little swoosh, be grateful. No one had to yell, no one had to duck, and your waste didn't land in the street, or on someone's shoulder, or in a child's sandbox. Because once upon a time, long before porcelain and plumbing, relief wasn't a private act. It was a shared performance, timed, public, loud, and always downward. Sleep and dirt. 3 fleas in a straw mattress. You lie down, the light is gone, the fire is out, the room is cold, but not silent. There's a shuffle near your feet, a squeak under the wall, the familiar creak of wood shifting under the weight of another restless night. You shift your shoulders, and the straw whispers. This is your bed, a sack of dried grass, flattened from years of use, slightly damp, always itching. Sometimes it smells like dust, sometimes like mould, sometimes like something that used to be alive and isn't anymore, but mostly it just smells like other people, because in the Middle Ages, you didn't sleep alone, not by choice, not by design, but by necessity. Beds were expensive, space was tight, warmth was precious. And so, the medieval night became a communal affair. Families slept side by side, layered together like firewood, parents, children, cousins, visitors, sometimes even strangers. If the hearth was warm and the innkeeper generous, you might wake up next to someone you'd never met before. There was no concept of personal space, no thread count pride, no pillow-top luxury, just straw and skin and breath and dirt. Mattresses, if you could call them that, were little more than cloth sacks stuffed with whatever the local farm had too much of: hay, moss, reeds, feathers if you were lucky. Over time, the stuffing compacted, grew musty, attracted bugs, and those bugs invited friends: fleas, lice, bed bugs, mites. You didn't fight them, you accepted them, like distant cousins who never left and always bit. Children were trained to check for lice by lamplight, combing hair, scratching scalps, picking insects off one another in the fire's glow, like grooming apes in a very cold zoo. Blankets were worse, rarely washed, heavy with dust, passed down, shared, folded at the foot of the bed until needed, and when they were, they brought with them the ghosts of every night before: sweat, smoke, skin flakes, and sometimes blood, because illness came at night, and when someone died in bed, the bed lived on, reused, restuffed, reclaimed. You didn't throw things away, you shook them out, dusted them off, tried not to think too hard, and still people slept, because sleep was the only escape from the noise, the hunger, the aching cold. So you wrapped yourself in whatever you had, pressed your body into the indentations carved by your father, tucked your toes into the same worn corner your sister used last winter, and you dreamed. You dreamed of warmth, of privacy, of silence, but mostly you dreamed of not scratching. Some wealthier homes had beds raised on platforms. This kept them away from rats, drafts, and the general misery of the floor. They had canopies, too not for beauty, but for catching thatch dust falling from the roof, or for shielding sleepers from droppings, because yes, animals lived in the rafters too, and in noble houses. Bedding became a status symbol. Feathers, embroidery, imported fabrics. But even there, the sheets weren't changed often. Water was scarce. Soap was harsh. Drying clothes in winter was impossible. So linens were aired out, hung in the wind, perfumed, not laundered. And when guests came, they shared the bed. Not a guest room, not a cot. The bed. In fact, the word bedfellow wasn't always romantic. It was practical. If you were travelling, you'd be paired with another stranger for the night simply to keep warm. In some court records, even political agreements were solidified by sharing a bed for one night, as a gesture of trust. Think about that lying next to your rival in the dark, hoping he doesn't snore or stab you. And through all of this grime, this intimacy, this never-ending itch, people still longed for rest. Because exhaustion is stronger than discomfort. A body that labours from dawn to dusk doesn't care if the mattress is clean. It cares if it's horizontal, if it holds you up just enough to surrender to sleep. And so, people developed tricks. They heated stones and wrapped them in cloth to warm the foot of the bed. They burned herbs near the pillows to chase away insects, or at least the smell of what was already living there. They sewed secret pockets into their blankets, hiding keepsakes or prayers, and they told stories, whispers under covers, fairy tales, gossip, confessions. The only time of day when people could speak softly without fear of being overheard by the world. There's poetry in that, even among the rags and straw, because this wasn't just sleep. It was survival, a nightly act of trust. You closed your eyes knowing the door wasn't locked, that something might bite, that someone might move beside you, and still you slept, because the human body can endure more than we think, even in the dirt, even in the dark. So tonight, when you smooth your sheets, when you fluff your pillow and sigh at the perfect firmness of your memory foam mattress, remember this. There was a time when 3 fleas in your straw bed wasn't a problem. It was a blessing. It meant the rats hadn't moved in. It meant the straw hadn't moulded. It meant you were home, and that was enough. Clothes you wear the dirt until it wears you. You wake up in the same clothes you fell asleep in. And that makes sense because they're the same clothes you wore yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. They're not pyjamas, they're not workwear, they're not a costume, they're everything. In the Middle Ages, Clothes weren't something you changed. They were something you lived in. A tunic, a chemise, maybe 2 layers in winter, wool, linen, a belt if you were lucky. You put it on when the weather turned cold, and you didn't take it off until the weather turned again, or until it rotted off. Laundry, as we know it, didn't exist. Washing was laborious, water was cold, soap was harsh, and time that belonged to God, the fields, or your landlord. So clothes became permanent, like skin. They moulded to your shape, absorbed your sweat, carried the scent of your days. You wore them to work, you wore them to sleep, you wore them to church, to funerals, to the occasional bay if you took one at all. And over time, they stopped being garments. They became geography, maps of your existence. A stain here from the stew last Thursday, a tear there from the fence you mended in April, a stiff patch on the shoulder from weeks of sun and dust and unspoken prayers. Washing, when it happened, wasn't gentle. People used ash. Yes, literal ashes from burnt wood, sometimes mixed with lye. You'd scrub the cloth on a flat rock, beat it with a paddle, hang it in the wind and hope it didn't freeze solid. And that was a best-case scenario. More often, the dirt stayed. It sank in, became part of the fibre, a layer of history stitched in by time and sweat. There were no Monday wash days, no linen closets, no changes of underwear. Underwear, if it existed, was for the wealthy. Everyone else relied on outerwear to do all the work. In fact, clothing was so scarce that when someone died, their clothes were inherited, not as keepsakes, as necessities. You didn't ask if they were clean, you were just glad they fit. Children wore hand-me-downs until the seams burst. Then the fabric was cut into patches, used to repair other clothes, then again for rags, then again for kindling. Nothing went to waste, especially not something as valuable as woven fabric, and forget fashion in the modern sense. There were no seasonal wardrobes, no casual Fridays. No, this doesn't spark joy donations. You wore what you had, and when it gave out, you wore what someone else didn't need anymore. Colours faded, hems frayed, laces snapped, and still life went on. People learned to judge class and status not by how clean you looked, but by how many layers you wore. Because owning a second tunic that meant something, to change clothes, even once a week, was an act of privilege, a quiet flex. An unspoken message I have enough to not smell like last Tuesday. And yet there's a strange kind of intimacy in this. Clothes knew you better than anyone. They knew where you itched, where you bled, where you bent your back in the fields and where you hunched over in the cold. They carried your shape long after your body changed, and sometimes after your body was gone, because burial clothes were also rare. More often, the dead were wrapped in shrouds, and the clothes were reclaimed by the living. There's something both practical and poetic in that. Imagine wearing your grandfather's tunic, not as tribute, but because it's the only one that fits. Imagine pulling on a sleeve and recognising the mended cuff your mother sewed 10 winters ago, and not washing it because the thread might loosen, and the memory with it. Clothes weren't fashion, they were continuity. Threads tying one generation to the next, dirty, frayed, resilient. Even nobles weren't immune to the grime. Their garments were finer, yes-steed with saffron or madder, lined with fur, sewn with gold thread, but they still sweated, still smelled, still relied on servants to beat the dust out, to brush off the evidence of feasts and failures. There's a record of one English queen whose underdress had to be peeled off after months of wear. No shame, just normal. Because even royalty couldn't escape the simple math of the Middle Ages. You have one body, you have one tunic, you make it work, and you live inside it until it stops being yours. So tonight, as you fold your clothes, as you complain about laundry day, as you debate whether that t-shirt is still clean enough, remember this. There was a time when changing clothes meant losing part of yourself. When dirt wasn't a problem, it was a personality, and when the phrase second skin wasn't metaphorical. It was your only protection, your only privacy, your only proof that you belonged to something, somewhere, someone, and if it itched, you scratched. If it stank, so did everyone else, and if it tore, you mended it, again and again, until finally the cloth gave up, and then you started over. Food and grit. Your bread is slowly killing your teeth. You're hungry. Again. You've been hungry for years, honestly just in different amounts, but tonight, there's bread, And that's something. It's round, dense, dusty. Hard enough to knock out a rat if you throw it right, which in the right town would be considered both a dinner and a sport, but it's food. So you eat, and with every bite, your jaw tightens, you clench, you grind, you tell yourself it's filling. What you don't say, what no one says, is that this bread is slowly sanding down your teeth. Because in the Middle Ages, bread was not the soft, pillowy loaf you buy at the store. It was heavy, flat, and full of surprises. The flour was ground using large stone mills, hand-powered or wind-driven, depending on your local engineering ambitions. And those stones, over time, shed particles, tiny flakes of rock, grit, dust. And that grit ended up in the flour, and that flour ended up in your bread, and that bread ended up in your mouth. Every bite you took was a quiet act of self-destruction, a chewing session with built-in dental erosion. Not that anyone called it that, they just called it supper. It's estimated that a peasant in the 13th century consumed enough stone residue each year to wear down their molars by millimetres. By age 40 your teeth were dull, flat, and aching. By 50 you chewed with your gums and prayed the soup was warm. And yet, bread was everything. It was 70-80% of your daily calories. You ate it at every meal. In the morning, with a smear of animal fat if you had it. At noon, dipped in ale. At night, cold and cracked and chewed beside a fire that didn't quite reach your feet. No bread, no survival. So people endured. They chewed through stone like it was a religious calling, and this wasn't the bread of the noble class. They had fine white loaves, sifted, sieved, baked soft and blessed, made from wheat grown on better land, milled in cleaner stones, and baked in well-tended ovens. But you got Messlina mix of whatever grains didn't get stolen by the birds: rye, barley, oats, sometimes pea flour, sometimes acorns, sometimes the leftover sweepings from the floor of the mill, texture gritty, flavour sour, mouthfeel geological. But you were grateful, because the alternative was hunger, and hunger was worse than grit. Most days, people didn't complain about the pain. They didn't have dental insurance. They didn't have dentists. They had toothaches, and that was that. You ate, you winced, you worked, you slept, and the bread kept coming. There were tricks, of course. Some folks soaked their bread in broth to soften it. Others crumbled it into allocrating a medieval cereal that could be chewed with fewer regrets. But more often, you just chewed harder. You got used to the ache. You chewed on one side, then the other, until both hurt equally, and the balance returned. And then you chewed again. If your teeth cracked, you picked out the pieces and kept going. You had no choice. There's something deeply ironic here. In a world where food was scarce, where famine loomed like winter fog, the food you did have slowly destroyed you. The very act of surviving wore your body down, and still, you kept going. You worked the fields, you pulled the roots, you ground the grain, you baked the loaf, you bit the bread, and your teeth died for it. Archaeologists today dig up skulls from medieval burial sites and find smooth, flattened molars worn down like river stones. Some with exposed nerves, some with abscesses, many with holes where teeth once were, and that's not counting the infections. Once a tooth cracked or decayed, bacteria had a direct route to the bloodstream. A simple cavity could turn fatal, all because of bread. And yet, bread was sacred. It was used in ritual, broken at altars, blessed by priests, shared at weddings and wakes. It was the most basic food, and the most symbolic. And it hurt. Every bite was both comfort and violence. Even the crumbs mattered. Children were taught never to waste them. Some families gathered crumbs and saved them in bowls for the next meal. Others fed them to animals, unless the animals were eating better than you, which happened more often than you'd think. And still, you thanked God for it, because bread meant life, even as it wore you down. So tonight, when you slice into a soft loaf warm, gentle, crusted but yielding when your teeth sink in without pain, without dust, without fear, pause. Imagine chewing gravel 3 times a day. Imagine praying for soup not because you liked the flavour, but because it gave your jaw a break. Imagine watching your teeth vanish, one bite at a time, and saying, at least in full, because once upon a time, the only thing worse than chewing stone was having nothing to chew at all. And that in its own strange way, was mercy. Liquids drink ale or die of water. You're thirsty. You've been working all morning hauling, chopping, bending, sweating. The sun is high and your throat is dry. You look around. There's a bucket of water by the door. It's warm. It's cloudy. Something may be floating in it. Something that used to swim, or worse, used to breathe. You hesitate. Because in the Middle Ages, thirst wasn't simple. It was strategic. It was about risk. And water wasn't safe. For most of human history, and we've been told water is life. In the Middle Ages, water was suspicious, opaque, foul, full of death. Streams ran brown. Rivers foamed with waste. Wells were shallow and often dug too close to the latrine. Rainwater sat in barrels, gathering bugs, algae, and the occasional drowned rat. And the public fountains, if they existed, were downstream from things that should never be upstream from anything. People drank water, yes, but always with hesitation, always as a last resort. Water was what you drank when you had no other option. When you were desperate. When your body didn't care anymore about the consequences. And for everyone else, there was something better. Allez, not the hoppy, artisan, small batch kind. Not something brewed for flavour or bragging rights. Ale was medicine. It was hydration. It was safer than water. And it was for everyone. Children drank ale. Nuns drank ale. Labourers, pregnant women, monks in silence, bakers at dawn. If you were alive, you drank ale. Because you had to. It was boiled during brewing, killing many of the pathogens. It was mildly alcoholic, just enough to prevent spoilage, not enough to turn the village into a tavern. This one about getting drunk. It was about staying alive. And so, it became routine. Ale with breakfast, ale with lunch, ale before sleep, not a toast, a tool. Even young children were given small beer a week, watery brew that looked like cereal milk and tasted like damp barley. No one questioned it. It was safer than the water in the bucket. And in a world where disease could bloom overnight, that was enough. There's a record of one 14th century household brewing over 3 gallons of ale per person, per day. And that wasn't excess. That was necessity. Because every time you opened your mouth to drink, you made a decision, ale or illness, and sometimes the ale didn't work. Sometimes it was brewed badly, sometimes it spoiled, sometimes it was contaminated with lead from the pipes or mould from the grains. But even then, it was usually better than the alternative. The alternative being drinking what the animals drank, what the tanners poured into the stream, what the butcher rinsed his knives in, what your neighbour tossed out a window last night after dinner. In cities, the problem multiplied. Too many people, not enough drainage, waste piled up in corners, drains overflowed, wells became poison, and yet water remained necessary. So people filtered it, boiled it, mixed it with vinegar or wine, added herbs, anything to disguise the risk, anything to make the danger feel domestic. Some used ceramic filters, primitive and mostly ineffective. Others trusted in God, and still others drank with closed eyes and open prayers. Meanwhile, the ale flowed, brewed in basements, in barns, in abbeys, stored in barrels that creaked with the seasons, distributed in jugs, scooped with ladles, passed hand to hand. There were rules. Ale had to be fresh. It didn't keep. You brewed today what you drank tomorrow, and if it soured, you drank it anyway, just with more bread to soak it up. For many, brewing was a household duty, especially for women. The alewife was a respected role, sometimes marked by a broom over the door or a carved wooden sign. She made the drink that kept the family alive. And sometimes she was accused of watering it down, of cheating the grain, of causing illness. Because when your only medicine is beer, the brewer becomes a kind of doctor, and when the doctor fails, people get angry. Some towns established official tasters inspectors who tested the strength and quality of ale and punished those who cheated. They were feared, respected, occasionally bribed, but ale remained. Through famine, plague, war, and winter ale persisted. It wasn't just hydration, it was a constant, a reminder that some things, at least, were within your control. You couldn't stop the rats, you couldn't purify the river, you couldn't trust the water in the well, but you could raise a mug, sip carefully, and live another day. So tonight, when you open your fridge and reach for a can and you worry if it's craft enough, cold enough, Interesting enough pause. And remember, there was a time when beer wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline. The only drink that wouldn't kill you. A bitter, barley-flavoured blessing in a wooden cup. And the next time someone says they're cutting out alcohol for their health, feel free to say that would have killed me in 1352, and be mostly right. Perfume and power, rosewater and suspicion. The first thing you notice isn't what you see, it's what you smell. A trace of rosewater. Sweet, sharp, delicate like silk, but also foreign. Too perfect, too intentional. It doesn't belong here. Not in a room that smells of wool and tallow and yesterday's bread. Not in a world where the average scent is somewhere between burnt cabbage and stale wood smoke. No, this is different, and that's exactly the problem. In the Middle Ages, perfume didn't whisper elegance, it shouted class, power, danger. Because in a time where most people smelled like work, to smell like a garden was a statement, and sometimes a threat. Perfume was expensive, imported, controlled, distilled from petals and resins brought over land and sea, jasmine from Syria, frankincense from Arabia, musk from animals no one in your village could pronounce. To wear perfume was to say, I do not work, I do not sweat, I do not touch dirt. It was a boundary, invisible, intoxicating, sharp as a drawn sword. The nobility used it to armour themselves in scent, dabbing their wrists with rose oil, sprinkling lavender in their linens, burning clove-stuffed pomanders as they walked through their halls. A duke might perfume his gloves, a queen might scent her bath-water, a cardinal might dab his robe with myrrh before giving a sermon. It wasn't about smelling good, it was about being untouchable. But not everyone found it impressive. To the poor, those who bathed once a month if they were lucky, who rubbed vinegar under their arms and stuffed herbs in their collars, perfume smelled like lies. It smelled unnatural, suspicious, witchy. If you walked into a tavern smelling of rosewater, you weren't admired. You were watched. Because why would anyone try to smell different? What were they hiding? What spell were they casting? In some towns, perfumed women were accused of sorcery. Not because they spoke Latin or read books, but because they smelled too clean. To reek of rosemary in a world of rot was to be unnatural, and the unnatural, in medieval logic, was rarely innocent. There's a documented case in southern France of a midwife being driven from her village because she used perfumed oil during births. They said she hexed the babies, all because the room didn't smell like blood and smoke. Even monks debated it. Was scent holy, or was it temptation? Some monastic orders allowed fragrant herbs to be grown in cloisters for health. For prayer, others banned them entirely, citing vanity and distraction. If God made us from clay, why would he want us to smell like lilies? And yet, the craving for fragrance endured, because perfume wasn't just luxury, it was protection. Remember, people believed disease travelled through smell. That foul air carried plague, that sweet scents repelled it. So perfume became more than indulgence. It was survival. To reek of cinnamon or sage was to guard your pores. To sprinkle rosewater on your face was to shield yourself from the invisible. Perfume was the poor man's medicine, if he could afford it, which he couldn't. The gap widened. The poor rubbed garlic on their skin. The rich wore ambergris, a substance harvested from whale intestines and sold by weight in gold. One group masked stink, the other curated elegance, and the distance between them wasn't just olfactory, it was political, because to smell good was to smell powerful. It told the world, I have servants, I have trade routes, I have time to distill, time to bathe, time to care. And in a time when most people didn't have time to live past 40, that message mattered. Perfume became part of ceremony, weddings, coronations, funerals. Even death had a scent. Corpses were wrapped in herbs, coffins sprinkled with dried flowers. The richer the body, the more fragrant the rot. It was the last gesture of control, a way to defy decay, to turn the smell of death into a kind of pageantry. But it never lasted. No matter how much rosewater was poured, the truth always returned. Beneath the musk and mint and myrrh, the body still broke down. So tonight, when you lift your cologne bottle, when you think about fresh and bold and masculine top notes, think about this. Once upon a time, smelling too good could get you accused of black magic. Smelling different meant exile. Smelling like roses meant you probably didn't dig ditches for a living. Perfume was more than a scent, it was a border, crossed too boldly, and people noticed. They didn't always like what they smelled, and if they didn't understand it, they burned it, or the person wearing it. Because power never arrives quietly, not even when it wears roses. Medicine versus hygiene lets bleed you to fix that smell. You don't feel well, you've got a fever, maybe, or a chill, or a headache that started last week and refuses to leave. You smell off, and in the Middle Ages, that meant something was wrong, because smell was diagnosis, and medicine was pain with a certificate. You shuffle to the local physician, which is to say a man with a beard, a pouch full of herbs, and enough Latin to be dangerous. He listens to your symptoms, he looks at your face, and he smells you. Then he nods, solemnly. Your humours are unbalanced, he says, which sounds important, until you realise it could mean anything. Too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, too tired, too angry, too alive. And the solution: bloodletting. Of course, because if your body isn't working right, the best answer must be to open it, just a little, just enough to release the pressure, or the heat, or the demons. They believed the body was a delicate balance of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. You got sick when they stopped getting along. Too much blood. You were too hot. Too much phlegm, too cold. Too much bile. Angry. Too little of anything weak, melancholy, possibly cursed. So if you had a fever, the doctor would say, let's take some blood out. If you had a rash, blood, a headache, blood, a bad dream, blood, smelled funny, definitely blood, and not gently. Veins were opened with knives, arms, ankles, necks, wherever the flow was good. Leeches were used for more delicate jobs, left to suck quietly as the patient prayed and the doctor squinted in approval. But blood wasn't the only solution. Cupping was another favourite. Heated glass or horn cups placed on the skin to draw bad air or just the top layer of dignity out of the flesh. Then there was scarification, slicing the skin in patterns to encourage bleeding, sweating, or drainage of excess spirit. Imagine being sick and your doctor offers you medieval body art. Feeling unwell, here's a scar that means less bile, and of course, shaving the head, not for lice, but to reduce mental heat. If your thoughts were racing, your scalp was obviously too warm, so off went the hair, sometimes with razors, sometimes with fire, anything to cool the brain. Some even recommended drilling tiny holes in the skull to release vapours. It didn't help, but it did stop the complaining, eventually. As for bathing, that was complicated. If you were hot, you could bathe, gently, briefly, with herbs, but only in spring, or under a waning moon, or if your priest said yes. If you were cold, bathing was dangerous. It opened the pores, invited illness, disrupted humours. You could bathe yourself into an early grave. Some doctors even warned that warm water could stir the blood too violently. Like a pot left to boil, you might faint, or bleed from the nose, or worse, relax, and that was never good. Medieval medicine hated comfort. If a treatment felt nice, it probably wasn't working. They didn't cure the body, they punished it into submission. Enemas were routine, administered with long brass syringes, often in public hospitals with no screens and no shame. You'd lie on a wooden bench while someone you barely knew blasted vinegar and herbs into your behind just to realign your inner weather system. Vomiting was encouraged, induced with roots, powders, or vigorous shaking, because whatever was inside you clearly wanted out, and the best way to help was to assist gravity. And yet, people trusted these methods, not because they worked, but because they matched the worldview. The body was flawed, dirty, always trying to betray you. You had to control it, clean it, purge it, reshape it into something that obeyed. Medicine wasn't healing, it was discipline. And if you survived the treatment, that meant it was successful. If you didn't, well, the humours must have been too far gone. Of course, not all medical figures were butchers. Some herbalists had real skill. Monks cultivated gardens of lavender, sage, mint. Women passed down recipes made from honey and willow bark. But they weren't always called doctors, and they weren't always trusted, because true medicine came with authority. A robe, a seal, a fancy scroll, even if that scroll said things like cure toothache with roasted mouse brains, treat fever with powdered emerald, prevent infection by swallowing a live spider, and when none of it worked, pray. Bleed, repeat. So tonight, as you reach for your Tylenol, as you trust that your thermometer isn't judging you, be thankful. No one is reaching for a knife. No one is drawing circles on your skin with a rusty spoon. No one is heating a cup or sharpening a lancet, or sniffing you like overripe cheese. You feel bad, but you'll survive, because once upon a time, to smell strange meant your blood was rising, and the solution was simple: less blood, more holes, maybe some vinegar. And if you complained, well, there's always the spider. Religious rituals of washing clean hands, dirty souls. The monk bows his head, is silent, still, wrapped in woolen prayer. He kneels beside a basin, not because his hands are dirty, but because it's time, because the bell has rung, because the rule says so. And in the world of medieval religion, rules are everything. This is not hygiene, not really. This is ritual. And ritual smells less like lavender and more like obedience. You see, in monasteries, those stone-walled sanctuaries of silence and discipline, washing was sacred. Not symbolic, not optional, not occasional. Prescribed, measured, unquestioned. Hands must be washed before meals. Feet must be washed on Holy Thursdays. Faces, if not daily, at least regularly enough to remind you that you are flesh. And flesh, left unattended, tends to remind everyone else. But don't confuse this with cleanliness as we know it. This was not about comfort, or scent, or health. This was about submission. The rule of St. Benedict, arguably the blueprint of medieval monastic life, doesn't talk about scented soaps or scrubbing hard behind the ears. It talks about humility, discipline, repetition. To wash was to accept your place. Low, earthy, imperfect, a servant of God. And the basin was the reminder. The act itself was often quiet, ceremonial. The bowl would be placed between two monks. One poured water, the other caught it. No soap, no splashing, just hands, water, cloth. And if it were Holy Thursday, the ritual deepened. On that day, abbots would kneel and wash the feet of their monks, a reenactment of Christ himself. Hands wrapped in linen, they'd pour water across calloused soles, muddy from fields or dusted from stone corridors, and dry them gently. It wasn't about hygiene, it was about reversal, about the powerful becoming low, about reminding everyone that even the leader touched the dirt. But let's be honest, the feet still stank. Because for all the symbolism, no one brought soap, no one changed the water between washes, and the same towel might dry 6 pairs of holy toes in a row. You didn't leave the chapel fresh, you left reminded elsewhere. Priests would wash before Mass, not because the altar was delicate, but because the act of touching the Eucharist required some visual gesture of purity. Clean hands, clean host, even if the fingernails told another story. And in the churches of the laity, those outside the walls, washing was rarer, but not absent. Pilgrims might wash before entering a shrine, not because the saint demanded it, but because the act made them pause, made them feel changed, prepared, worthy. But again, don't imagine spigots or soap or scented basins. Imagine a bucket, maybe 2, cold water, a cloth shared between strangers, a bench near the entrance where you dried off by the fire. If you were lucky, you didn't walk into church clean, you walked in corrected. And then there were baptisms, the ultimate religious bath, a full-body plunge if you were an adult convert, or a forehead splash if you were a wrinkled newborn with a future full of plagues. The water wasn't blessed for hygiene, it was blessed for transformation. You didn't come out smelling better, you came out marked, but even in these sacred spaces, suspicion lingered, because cleanliness, real, physical cleanliness, was always in tension with holiness. Too much bathing vanity, too much perfume temptation, too much time spent on the body, a sign that you'd forgotten the soul. So religious hygiene danced a line, just enough to be seen as pious. Not so much that it smelled like pride, and that's the irony. The people most devoted to order, purity, and spiritual discipline often lived in places that reeked of sweat, mildew, and wood smoke. Monasteries weren't sanitized havens. They were farms, kitchens, hospitals, scriptoriums filled with ink, wax, and the occasional mouldy manuscript. Monks laboured. They sweat. They wore the same robes day after day, sometimes for months. Their sheets were rarely washed. Their hands, though ritually cleansed, were still calloused and crusted. And yet they washed, religiously, because in the end, washing wasn't about outcome. It was about intention. You washed because the rule said so. You washed because Christ did. You washed because the motion mattered, even if the result was mostly symbolic. It's strangely beautiful and strangely tragic. A community that built its life around rhythm and repetition, performing acts of purification that never quite made anyone clean. But maybe that was the point. To live in dirt, to acknowledge it, to face it every morning in a cold basin, and say, I'm not clean. But I showed up. So tonight, when you wash your hands with soap that smells like eucalyptus or green tea or designer rain, when the hot water steams and the sink glows like an altar, think of them. Washing without heat, without lather, without illusion, just hands and water and hope. Because sometimes the soul stays dirty, and that's okay, as long as the bowl is full and the water is cold, and you remember why you bothered at all. Vanity and shame. Who are you washing, for she doesn't bathe often? No one does. The water's too cold, the firewood's too precious, the river's too far, and there's never any privacy. But tonight she pours a few drops of rose water onto a cloth, and she dabs her face, gently, quietly, in the dark. Not to cleanse, not really, but to pretend. It's market day tomorrow, and there will be people, and just maybe someone will notice her. Her dress is still the same one she wore all winter, stiff from wear, brown from fire smoke, the hem unravelling in silence. But maybe, if her face smells like flowers, it won't matter. Because in a world where survival is public, vanity is always private and fragile. She doesn't talk about it. No one does. But they all do it, just a little, a wiped collar, a combed patch of hair, a finger dipped in crushed mint. Small acts of rebellion, not against society, but against invisibility. There's a boy, too, 13, maybe 14. He found a sprig of thyme 2 weeks ago and has kept it hidden in his tunic pocket ever since. Dry, faded, mostly scentless, but still he presses it to his neck before going to fetch water, because that's where she'll be. The girl with the soft laugh and the braid that always comes loose by noon. He doesn't know her name. She doesn't know his. But maybe if the time works, she'll remember the way he passed her the bucket. It's not a plan, it's a possibility. In the Middle Ages, love wasn't expected. Marriage was economics. Attraction was luck. Smelling good was suspicious. And trying too hard, that was shameful. But people still tried. They still stood by reflective water to see if their cheeks were flushed. Still licked fingers to pat down their hair. Still hoped someone might see them in a room full of bodies and think, that one. Maybe that one. There's a letter from the 14th century where a girl writes to her cousin about a man she likes. She describes nothing about his face, just that he smelled like cloves and clean bread. That's it. That's what love smelled like to her. Not roses, not musk, just not awful. Because awful was the baseline. Sweat, manure, wet wool, foot rot. Anything above that was a fantasy. And fantasies mattered. A barmaid who dusts her sleeves with powdered chalk before pouring ale. A stable boy who wipes his boots before walking past the weaver's daughter. A young wife who burns time in the corner of her home before her husband return, not because hell care, but because she does. These gestures were invisible to history, but they happened every day. Beneath the disease, beneath the dirt, there was dignity. A kind of gentle defiance. A way of saying I still care what I look like. Even if no one's looking, and sometimes someone was a neighbour, a widow, a priest, a friend, a stranger passing by on a horse who remembered the scent of basil long after he forgot the town. But even when no one saw, the act mattered. There's power in hope, and there's poetry in ritual. In a girl quietly dabbing her cheeks before bed, just in case she dreams about someone tonight. In a boy pressing time to his neck and pretending he doesn't care what anyone thinks. In a man with cracked hands and yellowed nails who still trims them before walking to church. They don't do it for status. They don't do it for praise. They do it for possibility. for the idea that they are still human, still visible, still maybe lovable. And yes, sometimes it ends in disappointment. The girl isn't chosen, the boy is ignored, the stranger doesn't turn back, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes. Two people smell just enough like hope to notice each other, and that's all they need. A glance, a nod, a braid tucked behind an ear, a hand that lingers just a second longer than it should, and suddenly the dirt doesn't matter, the rags don't matter, the fleas, the smoke, the aching cold, they all fade because someone saw someone else try, and that trying made them beautiful. So tonight, when you adjust your collar in the mirror, or smooth your hair before a Zoom call no one will remember, or pick a shirt that fits just right even though you're home alone, don't laugh at yourself. Don't call it vanity. Call it hope. Call it courage. Because once upon a time, to wash your face with rose water was to say I want to be loved, even if I'm not sure I deserve it, and someone, somewhere, always noticed. Rural versus urban. The countryside stinks differently. It's morning, you step outside, take a breath, and immediately regret it. Because whether you're in a medieval village or a bustling town square, one thing is always true: it smells badly, but differently. Because contrary to what romantic oil paintings would have you believe, there was no clean air in the Middle Ages. There was no fresh countryside breeze or brisk urban morning. There was only flavourful air, and every region had its own recipe. Let's begin in the countryside. You wake up in a thatched cottage. One room, maybe two if your family's rich in chickens. The floor is dirt, the mattress is straw. The air is thick with smoke from the hearth that never quite drafts out properly. But outside is farm air, which is to say mud, manure, and morning dew if you're lucky. It's a blend that hits you fast. Earthy, sharp, sour on the nose. You might call it organic. Your nose would call it unforgivable. Because you live alongside your animals. They're not out in some separate barn with a door. They're in the house, literally. Chickens under the bed, the goat tied to the post, maybe a pig who sleeps closer to the fire than you do. They smell. You smell. But eventually, you all agree not to notice. That's country life. The smell of work. The smell of survival. Fertilizer isn't purchased. It's shoveled. By hand. From cow to field. From field to plate. And back again. No part of the cycle ever really leaves your nostrils. Now let's travel to the city. Same era, different odour. You're in a townstone buildings, narrow alleys, crowded markets. You take a breath, Ander, your civilization. The air smells like urine, spoiled meat, and 11 kinds of rotting hope. The streets aren't paved, they're covered in a slurry of rain, horse dung, and contributions from above. Because when your neighbour yells guard low from a second-story window, it's not just theatre, it's self-defence. You don't run because you're rude, you run because you want to live. And the markets. Oh, the markets. There are no refrigerators, no ice, no expiration dates, just a man waving flies away from a sheep's liver that stopped being edible 2 days ago. You don't shop with your eyes, you shop with your threshold for nausea, and yet the city smells more complex, more layered. There's a bakery on one end. You smell warm bread, there's a tanner on the other, you smell boiled urine and stretched hide. Somewhere in between, someone is frying eels, or maybe just burning them. It's a mosaic of misery, a tapestry of scents, and none of them are quiet. But here's the thing, people adapt. Ask someone from the countryside, and they'll say the city stinks like death. Ask someone from the city, and they'll say the village smells like a cow gave up halfway through digestion. They're both right, because stench is regional, it's local culture, passed down like folklore, normalised through proximity. You don't notice the smell of the pig until you visit the tanner. You don't flinch at the alleyway urinal until you spend a week in a sheepfold. One isn't better, they're just different. And that difference divides people. In town, villagers are called mudbacks. In villages, townsfolk are called gut sellers. One group smells like animals, the other smells like meat that used to be an animal. In cities, you pretend you're sophisticated. In villages, you pretend you're pure. Both of you are wrong, because purity doesn't exist. Only proximity, to manure, to fish, to tannin, to garlic breath. to the chamber pot you forgot to empty last night. And yet, each place believes the other is worse. There's something oddly human about that. The desire to believe that your filth is honest, while someone else's filth is unnecessary. You grew up in it. You married near it. You'll be buried just beside it. But then they choose that stink, as if any of us had a choice. In the countryside, you stink because you raise animals. In the city, you stink because you slaughter them. Either way, the pig doesn't care, and so you stop complaining. You learn to navigate the scent map. You know when the butcher's offal goes out. You know when the river's lowest, and the fish rot fastest. You know which alley leads to the bakery and which one leads to tears. You adapt, because you must, because the nose always gets tired before the lungs, and eventually, the smell becomes memory. Years later, you'll remember the scent of your childhood village, the smoke, the dung, the fresh-cut hay. You'll remember the salt tang of the docks, the sour-sweet perfume of fermenting wine casks behind the tavern. You'll remember them kindly, even fondly, because you didn't just breathe them, you lived in them. So tonight, as you open your window and take in the sterile, climate-controlled air of the 21st century, filtered, deodorized, digitally managed, remember, there was a time when where you lived could be described in one sentence. It stinks, but not like there. It doesn't look like much. Just a lump, really, off-white, misshapen, rough around the edges, a scent you can't quite place somewhere between burnt fat and dry hay. But to the woman holding it, this isn't a bar of soap. It's a small, solid piece of hope. She rubs it between her hands. It doesn't lather. Not really. It's more paste than foam, more resistance than reward. Still, she breathes in. And for one long second, she feels clean. Not because she is, but because she tried. In the Middle Ages, trying was everything. Soap, as we know it, wasn't common. It wasn't packaged in floral wrappers. It didn't come in hotel boxes or 3-for-1 bundles. It was made at home, with risk and fire and prayer. You started with fetishly animal fat, melted down in a pot, thick and greasy. Then you added ashes, hardwood ashes soaked in water, boiled down into a substance called lye, caustic, dangerous, essential. Too little lye, the soap wouldn't work. Too much. It might take the top layer of your skin with it. You stirred, you waited, you hoped. Then you poured it into a moulder bowl, a box, anything that would hold shape. And then you waited again. When it was done, it didn't sparkle, it didn't shine, it cracked, it crumbled, it left residue on your shelf. Sometimes it melted into mush, sometimes it dried into a rock, but it was soap, or at least close enough. In wealthier towns, soap making became a trade. Cities like Marseille, Aleppo, and Venice produced finer bar smooth, fragrant, soft to the touch, made from olive oil, scented with herbs, shaped like luxury. But for most people, those were rumours, stories told by merchants, objects glimpsed in passing like jewellery or nobility. For the rest of the world, soap was struggle, a domestic fire hazard, an experiment, a thing made in silence, handed down with no label, no recipe, just instinct. And yet, it mattered. Because even in a world where water could kill you, where bathing was discouraged, where people feared open pores and bad air, a little piece of gritty soap still meant something. You'd use it on your hands, your face, maybe. Never too much had to make it last. You'd scrub with a cloth, or a handful of straw. No sponge, no loofah, no towel warmers, just friction and hope. Sometimes it stung, sometimes it left you red, sometimes it didn't do anything at all. But still you reach for it, not to impress anyone, not because someone told you to, but because you wanted to feel a little less filthy, even if just for a minute. And when it worked, when the smell of smoke or sweat faded, even slightly it felt like relief, like control, like resistance, because the world was messy, diseased, chaotic. Your body ached, your roof leaked, your teeth were crumbling, but you still had your soap. That tiny act of lathering your hands, of wiping your face, became a kind of declaration I am still a person. In a time when everything about you was political, economic, religious or invisible. Soap was personal, quiet, unspoken, a ritual with no priest, a prayer with no words. There's something touching about that. About the woman scrubbing her arms with ash water in the corner of a freezing hut. About the boy polishing his fingers before a church feast. About the old man who saves a sliver of soap for when his grandchildren visit so he can greet them not smelling like hay. These stories didn't make it into the history books. No parchment records the names of those who tried to stay clean. But they were there, and they mattered. Because cleanliness wasn't vanity. It was self-respect. You didn't wash to show off. You washed to feel human, to feel worthy, to forget, for just a moment, that you shared a mattress with lice and a roof with rats. Soap wasn't a cure. It didn't stop the plague. It didn't save your crops. It didn't keep your baby from coughing through the night. But it gave you something to do, and sometimes, in the worst of times, having something to do is everything. Even monks believed that. In their quiet cloisters, they made soap in wooden vats, simple bars for sacred hands. Not perfumed, not polished, but meaningful. They washed before prayer, not to be pure, but to remember the gesture, to honour the ritual, to prepare themselves for something larger than the mud under their feet. Even they knew clean hands didn't make a clean soul, but it was a good place to start. Some people use soap to treat wounds, others to calm rashes, some just to smell a little less like the weak. In every case, the message was the same. I'm still here, I still care. It's easy to laugh at it now, to look at a crumbly bar of pig-fat soap and think, that's disgusting. To picture someone washing in a river full of runoff and wonder what's the point. But the point was never perfection. It was participation, a way to stand against the tide of filth and say, not today. Today I wash. So tonight, when you step into your shower, hot, scented, tiled, private, and you reach for your body wash labelled ocean breeze or mountain spring or volcanic charcoal infusion pores, and remember her, the girl with the cracked knuckles and the hardened soap, wiping her face in the corner of a cold room, no mirror, no towel, no praise, just the smallest bar of hope in the dirtiest century imaginable. And for one breath, one blessed breath, she felt clean. Your hands are clean, warm, soft, scented with something like coconut and sea salt and marketing. You press your palms together, no grit, no blood, no ash. Your toothbrush hums gently in the background. Your towel is fluffy. Your bathroom is lit by soft bulbs. Not flickering flame. You're safe. You're alive. And your body, you're blessed, stubborn. Miraculous body has survived. Not just the day, not just the week, but the whole brutal, baffling history of being human. Because once upon a time, your ancestors scrubbed themselves with rags dipped in vinegar. They feared warm water. They bathed in basins they shared with goats. They shaved their heads to calm their fevers. They believed their toothache had a worm inside it and their soap might kill them before the plague did. They wore their clothes until they fused with their skin. They slept in piles, 3 kids deep, 1 blanket short. They ate bread that eroded their enamel like river rocks. They drank ale because the water would murder them, and they whispered prayers into damp rags because there was nothing else to whisper into. Not a fun day, but at least no one asked you to dance with the plague. Their bodies were battlefields, open to infection, exposed to filth, ruled by superstition, ravaged by care, but still they tried. They tried with cracked hands and lice-bitten scalps. They tried with ash and cloth and shame. They tried with soap made from goat fat and prayers stitched into every corner of the house. They didn't have wellness. They didn't have self-care. They had survival and the occasional clove. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes all it took was a handful of mint under the collar, a rag warmed by the hearth, a stolen drop of rose water, a clean finger, a quiet moment. That was their ritual. That was their defiance. To keep going despite the smell, despite the blood, despite the knowledge that dirt always won. And yet here you are. You have a sink, a shower, a bed you don't share with strangers or straw mites or the memory of someone else's sweat. You have soap that foams, towels that dry, moisturizer that smells like cucumber instead of regret. Your pores open when you want them to. You don't fear the breeze. You don't gag when the air moves. You don't have to dodge waste flying out of windows. You don't scrub your teeth with linen dipped in stale urine. You don't burn herbs because you think it'll stop the Black Death. But if you listen closely, if you breathe slowly, you might still hear them. The whispers of the ones who came before. The girl who rubbed lavender on her neck, hoping to be chosen. The boy who chewed fennel because he thought love might smell it. The mother who cut soap into equal chunks for 5 children, each chunk wrapped in cloth like it was gold. The monk who washed another monk's feet and whispered nothing, but meant everything. They're gone now, but their echoes are still in you. Every time you rinse your hands, you finish their unfinished gesture. Every time you breathe in shampoo, you exhale a history of survival. Every time you let yourself restrictly rest, you rewrite the story of what the body's for, not just to carry you through pain, but to remind you that you are still here, still soft, still warm, still worthy of comfort. The Middle Ages were not kind to the body, but the body refused to break. It kept walking and kept bending and kept aching and healing and aching again. It gurgled and itched and cracked and stank. It lost teeth, gained scars, stumbled forward, but it never stopped being yours. You are the result of every body that didn't give up, every hand that scrubbed, every toe that froze, every back that bore fleas, and still stood up the next day to fetch water. And now you get to lie down on a bed that isn't crawling, under sheets that smell like detergent and maybe, if you're lucky, lavender. You get to dim the lights, turn on the fan, and feel safe in your skin. You get to rest. Not because you've earned it, not because you deserve it, but because someone long ago decided that you might. Someone decided that despite the dirt and the danger, it was still worth washing, still worth cleaning, still worth hoping. And tonight, you carry that forward. So take a final breath. The air is clean, your hands are clean, your thoughts can wait. No demons are sneaking through your pores. No one is watching from the rafters. No one is about to shout Gardlow from a window. It's just you, and the hum of the room, and the weight of the blanket that smells like fresh cotton and a quiet day. The war is over. The body has survived, and you get to sleep. We've talked about what was on the skin. We've talked about what was in the bed. But let's talk about the hair, the crown you were born with. The one part of you that grew and grew and grew, and you couldn't really stop it. Because in the Middle Ages, hair was not a friend, it was a problem. It was a tangle of social rules, physical discomfort, and, well, life. A silent, constant, creeping kind of life that made its home in the tangles of your braid. And this life, of course, was lice. Forget the modern idea of hair as a place for shampoos and styling products. Forget the soft, flowing locks in medieval paintings. Those paintings were lies. Propaganda for the eyes. The reality was a mess. Your hair was rarely, if ever, washed. It was matted with sweat and smoke, greasy from weeks without cleansing. And if you tried to wash it, you were back to the same old problem: the cold, the risk, the fear. So instead of washing, people learned to manage. They used combs, of course. Rough-toothed combs made of wood or horn. But these weren't for styling. They were for battle, for scraping away at the scalp, trying to dislodge the tiny, biting armies that had set up camp in your head. Children had their heads combed by lamplight, a quiet, nightly ritual of picking and scratching and hoping. Because if you didn't, the itching would drive you mad, and madness was a luxury you couldn't afford. This wasn't a private shame. It was a public understanding. Everyone had them. It was just a question of who had fewer. And yet, despite the dirt, hair was everything. It was a powerful social signal, a public display of who you were, what you were, and who you belonged to. And that's where headwear comes in. You see those grand, elaborate veils and wimples in the pictures. Those isn't just for fashion. That was armour, a soft, intricate defence against the world. For a married woman, her hair was a sign of her sexuality. It was seen as tempting, dangerous, almost a spiritual distraction, so it had to be covered, sealed away, and a wimple that tight, stiff linen that went from the chin to the hairline was a perfect solution. It said, "I am a wife. I am pious. My sexuality is contained." But it also served a secondary purpose. It contained the mess. It kept the hair hidden, the grease contained, and the lice. Well, the lice at least weren't falling onto the dinner table. It turned hair from a battlefield into a secret, For unmarried girls, the rules were different. They were allowed to let their hair down, to wear it in braids, to show it off as a sign of their youth and availability. A long, well-kept braid wasn't just pretty, it was a resume. It said, "I am young, strong, and can spend the time and effort to maintain myself." And men, they had their own battles. Their hair could be a sign of their status. A knight might wear his hair long and curled, a symbol of his nobility. A peasant might wear it short, for practicality. But both men and women relied on hats, coifs, caps, not just for style, but for protection, from the cold, from the sun, and most importantly, from the things falling out of windows and out of the thatched roofs. A hat wasn't a choice, it was a helmet, a shield against a world that was constantly, slowly, trying to drop things on your head. Hair was a battle, and headwear was a truce. It was a way of pretending you were clean, of pretending you were safe, of pretending that the world wasn't a tangled, greasy mess from the crown of your head all the way to the soles of your feet. And sometimes, in a world where everything was chaos, a good lie was just as comforting as the truth. My friends, if you're still with me, I want to thank you. Taking the time to join me on this journey, to step back into a world that often felt so alien to our own, is something I truly appreciate. We've spent nearly 2 hours breathing the thick, deep-grey, smoky air of the Middle Ages, wincing at the thought of a rag dipped in vinegar, and perhaps, for just a moment, feeling a shared phantom itch. It's a lot to take in. It's a lot to sit with. And before we go our separate ways, I want us to take a moment to reflect on what this strange, sometimes disgusting, trip through history can teach us, because history, as I see it, isn't just a collection of dates and names. It's a mirror. It shows us where we've been, so we can better appreciate where we are. It's a lesson in gratitude, a study in resilience, and a reminder of the things that truly matter. Let's dig in, shall we, and find the humanity buried beneath all that dirt. The first and most obvious lesson from our time in the Middle Ages is a profound sense of gratitude for the simple things. We've become so accustomed to the comforts of our modern world that we often forget they are, in fact, luxuries. A hot shower, a flush toilet, a bar of soap that doesn't burn your skin, a bed that isn't teeming with mites. These aren't just conveniences. They are the fruits of centuries of innovation and struggle. Think back to the open door theory, the fear that warm water could open your pores and invite sickness. Imagine living in a world where the very act of trying to get clean was seen as a dangerous gamble. Now, think about your last shower. The steam, the soothing heat, the lather of the soap. It's not just a way to wash away the day's grime. It's an act of pure, unadulterated safety and comfort that our ancestors couldn't have imagined. Or consider the simple act of drinking a glass of water. Our medieval counterparts drank Alanot for the taste, but because the water in the wells and rivers was often a swirling cocktail of disease, they had to choose between intoxication and illness. You and I simply turn on a tap. That tap, my friends, is a miracle. It's a silent, constant testament to the work of scientists, engineers, and public health officials who have given us a world where thirst is no longer a matter of life or death. So, the next time you get a cool drink of water, take a moment to be grateful. It's a quiet tribute to every person who chose ale just to make it to the next day. This gratitude extends to our homes, our clothes, and our food. We can buy bread without chewing through stone. We can change our clothes every day, not just every season. We can sleep in a bed that is exclusively ours, without sharing it with strangers or rats. These are not minor details. They are fundamental pillars of a life of dignity and ease. By understanding what life was like without them, we can appreciate the immense privilege we have in simply existing in our own time. The second lesson is perhaps the most humbling, the incredible resilience of the human spirit. It's easy to look back at the Middle Ages and see only misery, but that's a superficial view. Beneath the filth and the fear, people still found ways to be human. They laughed, they loved, they created, and they endured. Remember the communal bathhouses before they were shut down? They were a lukewarm soup of sin. Yes, but they were also places of community. People didn't just go there to wash. They went to talk, to gossip, to eat, and to find a moment of warmth in a cold world. That desire for connection, for shared experience, is something that transcends time and dirt. They found a way to turn a chore into a social event, to find joy in a shared, steamy room, even if it was a bit unsanitary. Think about the tiny acts of vanity and hope we discussed. The girl dabbing her face with a drop of rosewater before market day. The boy with a sprig of thyme tucked into his tunic. These weren't grand gestures. They were small, private acts of rebellion against a world that wanted to wear them down. They were a way of saying, I am still a person, I still care, I still hope. And in those moments, they found a kind of strength that is truly inspiring. They knew their efforts might not make a difference in the grand scheme of things, but they did it anyway. They fought the dirt because it was a way of fighting despair. That fundamental impulse to find beauty and dignity in the face of ugliness is one of the most powerful things about us. Our deep dive into medieval life also reveals a lesson about community. We've become so focused on personal space and privacy that the idea of a shared bed or a public latrine seems horrifying. And yet, for them, it was simply life. Think about the sheer closeness of their existence. Families sleeping in a single room, sharing a bed, a meal, and a fate. It forged a kind of bond that we can hardly comprehend. They knew each other's smells, their sicknesses, their sorrows, and their small victories. This intimacy, while physically uncomfortable, created a dense social fabric. They relied on each other in a way that we rarely do today. A neighbour's cry of "guard low" wasn't just a warning, it was a part of a shared, communal rhythm. In our world, we can choose our social circles and create digital connections across continents. But in the Middle Ages, your community was your world. It was a net that caught you when you fell, and a constant presence that you couldn't escape. There's a powerful lesson in that, a reminder of the enduring human need for belonging. We may have more space and privacy, but we may also have lost a certain closeness that comes from facing hardship together. Finally, let's talk about perspective. We've used the word dirty repeatedly throughout this journey, but we must do so with the understanding that it's a modern judgment. To a person in the Middle Ages, clean wasn't a sterile, scent-free state. It was a matter of managing the chaos. Clean enough meant the smell wasn't overwhelming. It meant the rag wasn't dry. It meant you had a bar of soap, no matter how crude. They weren't ignorant. They were resourceful. They made the best of what they had, using vinegar, herbs, and ash to create a world that, while foreign to us, made perfect sense to them. They were trying, scraping, dabbing, hoping. The dirt was always winning, as we said. But the fact that they kept trying is the real story. This teaches us to be more empathetic, not just to the past, but to each other. It reminds us that our definitions of success, comfort, and cleanliness are not universal truths. They are products of our time, our technology, and our culture. By understanding the why behind their what, we can see them not as dirty, but as survivors, not as ignorant, but as innovative in their own way. It's a powerful lesson in historical humility, and a good reminder to reserve judgment. Thank you again, my friends, for travelling through the most awkward corners of history with me. It's an honour to have your company. Your time and attention mean the world, and I truly hope this journey has given you a new perspective on the small miracles of your everyday life. But our journey doesn't end here. The past is vast and filled with endless stories just waiting to be told. If you enjoyed this slow, wonderfully weird drift through medieval life, I would be honoured if you'd consider a few things. First, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. It's the single best way to make sure you don't miss our next adventure into the unknown. When you subscribe, you're not just clicking a button. You're telling me that this type of storytelling, this kind of journey, is something you value, and that means more than I can possibly say. It helps me continue to research, to write, and to bring these stories to life. Second, if this video resonated with you, and you're feeling generous, a simple like on the video would be a wonderful way to show your support. It helps YouTube know that this content is worth sharing, and it allows us to reach other curious minds who might also enjoy stepping through the most awkward corners of history with us. And finally, I'd love to hear from you. In the comments below, please share what surprised you the most about this video. What little detail stuck with you? What did you find most inspiring, or perhaps most disgusting? I read every single comment, and your thoughts and insights are not only valuable, but they help shape where we go next. It helps me know what parts of history you're most interested in exploring. So, as we close this chapter, I want to leave you with a simple thought. Look around you. Appreciate the soap, the warm water, the clean sheets. These aren't just things. They're a legacy. A legacy built on the backs of those who lived without them. A legacy that we have a duty to appreciate and to honour. Next time, we'll be taking another step back in time, to a place just as foreign and fascinating as the one we've just left. We'll be exploring the forgotten history of medicine, the curious cures, the bizarre beliefs, and the unexpected insights that changed our understanding of the human body forever. It's another journey that will make you grateful for your own life, and another chance for us to learn about ourselves by learning about those who came before us. Until then, thank you, be well, and remember to wash your hands. Well, be waiting for you. Hey, and welcome back. If you're here, it means you're ready to take another journey with me. You're ready to leave the comfort of your clean, quiet, 21st century life and step into a world that, by our standards, was almost a different planet. We're not going to be talking about kings and queens, or grand battles, or the intricate details of a royal court. We're going to be talking about something much more intimate, much more personal, and much, much more fragrant. I want you to take a moment and just breathe. Inhale deeply. What do you smell? Maybe it's the clean scent of fresh laundry, or the lingering hint of yesterday's coffee. Maybe it's the subtle, sterile smell of a room that has been tidied and organised. It's a smell of quiet modernity, of convenience and control. It's the smell of safety. It's a smell our ancestors wouldn't have understood. Now, I want you to close your eyes, just for a second. Imagine waking up in the year 1243. The first thing that hits you isn't the light from the window, but the air. It's thick, heavy. It's a sensory assault that climbs into your nostrils and makes a home there. It smells of wood smoke and damp earth, of unwashed wool and sour bread. It smells of the animals sleeping just a few feet away, of the wet straw on the floor, and of the person next to you who hasn't bathed in 5 days. It is a smell that clings, that defines, that communicates, and it's a smell that no one complains about, because no one has ever known anything different. This is the world we're stepping into tonight, a world where cleanliness wasn't a given, and hygiene was a desperate, often futile, battle against the tide. This won't be a history of heroes, but a history of human beings. It's a slow, wonderfully disgusting journey through the most awkward and forgotten corners of daily life. The kind of history that makes you grateful for every bar of soap, every hot shower, and every fresh breath of air you've ever taken. It's the kind of history that, if we're lucky, will be strangely perfect for sleep. So, before we begin, take a second to make yourself comfortable, get a blanket, pour yourself a drink that you know is safe to consume, and as you get settled, if you enjoy drifting through these forgotten corners of the past with me, please consider taking a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It's a small, simple gesture that means the world to us, and helps us continue to create these deep dives into the human story. If you're new here, know that we're a community of curious minds, all trying to make sense of a past that often feels very, very foreign, and I'd love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is over there. It's always fascinating to see who else is trying to sleep through filth and folklore with me. Now, let's begin our journey. Imagine waking up in the year 1243. Your blanket is damp. Your shirt hasn't left your body in 5 days. You can smell the goats. You don't own goats. And no one complains, because no one is clean. But they're trying, scraping, dabbing, hoping. So tonight, we'll breathe with them, sniff with them, maybe even scratch with them. Let's get something straight. Medieval people weren't dirty because they liked it. They were dirty because the world didn't give them much of a choice. They wanted to be clean. They tried. But when your bath water is hauled from a river filled with animal waste, and heating it takes 2 hours and all the firewood you have, you start to compromise. Instead of full baths, most people went with the wipe and hope method, a damp cloth, a splash of vinegar, a few herbs shoved in the collar. Was it clean? No. Did it feel cleaner than nothing? Absolutely. Bathhouses existed. People used them. They were kind of like the town spa meets the local gossip hub meets a risk of syphilis. But then the plague hit, and everyone started worrying that warm water opened your pores, and open pores were basically an open door for death. So no more bathhouses. The body, they believed, had to stay sealed. Cleanliness wasn't about removing dirt. It was about not dying from exposure to hot air and your own vulnerability. People still made efforts. They chewed mint leaves. They rubbed ash on their hands. They stuffed rosemary and thyme in their sleeves to mask the smell of, well, themselves. Some monasteries even had routines washing the hands, washing the feet, not for hygiene, for humility. Because if your feet stink in the name of God, that's apparently okay. Now, if you were rich, you had options. Servants could heat your bath water. You might even own soap made from fat, ash, and prayers. It burned, it cracked, it sometimes worked. But even nobles didn't bathe often. Why? Same fear, open pores, and they didn't want to get caught smelling too good. Yes, smelling good was suspicious.